Hello everyone. In this week's video lectures, we are going to be talking about disk technologies and the types of disks that we can use in Windows 10. How we use them, the different ways we can initialize them, partition them, format them, and things like that. Also, we're going to talk about NTFS, Windows File System technology, that has been around for a long time, and it has a lot of extra features and allows us to do many things both with the disks and with the files stored on the disks. So, first things first, we need to get to the place where we can manage the disks. That is, not ironically, titled Disk Management. To get there, it's inside the Computer Management console that we talked about last week. So if we go down to the Start menu and we get to Computer Management, it pops up here. We should see Disk Management right here. Now, I have added a couple of hard drives to my virtual machine, and I haven't done anything to them. So basically, this is as if I had plugged in some hard drives in my computer, closed it up, turned the computer on. So there are things that are going to need to be done to these disks, because right now there's absolutely nothing on them. They're completely blank. So if I click on Disk Management, first thing it's going to do, it's going to say, hey, whoa, I've got some stuff here, I don't know how to read it. Basically because there's nothing there. So we need to initialize the disk using what we call a partition format to allow us to be able to use the disk, because the operating system needs some way to interact with the disk and know what is on the disk. It needs some table, some list of these are the files that are on the computer. Well, right now there's no file, there's no table at all. We need to create an index, a table of contents, if you will, to be able to have the operating system look at the disk and know what is inside the disk. So this is where initialization comes in. Now, before I talk about this, I want to point out, if you look down here, these two disks are the ones that I've added. They're new. Notice they have a little red down arrow. That means that they are not usable right now. They're offline. You cannot use them because we don't have a table for them yet. So let's create a table. We've got both disks. I'll create a new one. I'll create them for both of them. There are two types of partitions or partitioning that we can do. We can do MBR, Master Boot Record, which is an old and still very effective way of managing the hard drive, and this uses or is used by BIOS, B-I-O-S, Basic Input Output System. That is, for our purposes, is baked into the motherboard and is what allows us to actually start the computer in the first place. The BIOS looks for the hard drive that has the operating system and then goes to the spot on the hard drive where the operating system is located and starts the system. And so that's essentially what BIOS does. It does a lot more than that, and you'll cover that more in an A+ class. But for our purposes, BIOS, that is one way to start up the computer and manage the hardware on the computer. The other way, if we were to use GPT, is the UEFI method. BIOS and UEFI functionally do the same thing. UEFI does more, has more options. It's a modern version of BIOS. Most modern machines support UEFI. All machines at this point will still support MBR. So I'll just stick with MBR for now because it won't matter for us all the extra functionality that UEFI would give us. So if I say OK, here it is going to take these disks and it's going to create a master boot record. It's basically going to create that table, that index, so we can look at the disks. They're still going to be empty, but now we'll be able to use them. And as you see, they no longer have their little down arrow, and they're both ready to go. They're still unallocated. They're still empty. There's nothing there. We haven't assigned anything. But now they're ready to use. Once these disks have been initialized, they are ready to be, well, partitioned or allocated to areas. So right now we have basic disks. These are all basic. You may also have something called a dynamic disk. If I right-click on the disk itself, you can see some options converting to dynamic disk, GPT disk, and then these different volumes. Now, the span, striped, and mirrored volumes, these are all a legacy form that Windows 10 is using called RAID, Redundant Array of Independent Disks or Independent Drives. Now, this is still heavily used in many, many places, including server technology. But Windows 10 has a different way of handling these that we're going to talk about in another lecture. So the book recommends that you do not use these anymore. They're functional, and if you know how to use them, great. But we can do the same thing. We can accomplish the same thing with a new technology that Windows 10 has to offer. Dynamic disks, the book actually tells you probably shouldn't use. The reason you shouldn't use it is that dynamic disks are only good, they only work with other Windows machines that have dynamic disks set up in this way. A lot of disk tools, recovery tools, they don't deal with dynamic disks. And so if you have any problems, you are basically out of luck. There's not much you can do if your dynamic disk gets damaged or if it starts acting up. So they recommend that you stick to basic disks and then use the storage spaces that Windows has to offer. Okay, so dynamic disks, though, give you an option. They give you options to do things like span across multiple disks, hence the span volume, and other things. So I wanted to show you this basically to tell you, don't worry about these. You'll need to know what a dynamic disk is, but these volumes we will cover in a different place. So now how about stuff that you actually can do, or that I'd like you to do? If we look at the disk, at disk 1 here, it's got a bunch of unallocated space. So if we want to use it, we need to create a disk. We need to create space, create a partition, essentially. Now, partitions, if you imagine a box, and if you put a divider in the box, you now have 2 partitions in a box. And then if you put another few dividers, you can have 4 partitions in the box, 4 spaces to put things all in a single box. That's essentially what partitions are for drives. It allows us to chop up the drive into different pieces that we can then put different things in. It's all stored on the same physical hard drive, but we're basically splitting up the physical hard drive into 2 different pieces. So to do that, if I right click here, I have the option of creating a simple volume. A simple volume is what it says. It's just going to store stuff on this space. So I'll create a simple volume. The wizard comes up and it basically just says, how much space do you want this volume to be? Well, let's say I want to have 2 different spaces. I want 2 different chunks of my hard drive. I want half of my hard drive for one thing, and I want half of it for another. So I can say I only want to use some of my drive. This is how much space in megabytes that my drive could hold. 10 gigabytes, excuse me, 10,000 megabytes. So I'm going to do half of it. I'm going to say I want 5,000 of it to be supported, to be for this volume. So, okay. It'll then assign it a drive letter. We'll talk about drive letters when we get to NTFS. And say okay. And then format as NTFS. And I'm going to call this homework, because I'm going to have one file, one partition for my homework, and I'm going to have a partition for something else. So, okay. So it's going to complete, okay. And now I have a 5 gigabyte partition for my homework, and then I have the other half, a little more than half, is unallocated yet. I haven't used it yet. So I'll come up with something for it. Okay, so I can have up to 4 partitions on a basic disk. If I were to have a dynamic disk, by the way, I could have any number of partitions. We call them volumes in that sense. But again, we're telling you not to use them. So for the basic disk, you can have up to 4 different partitions. Notice your original disk here, we already have 2 partitions. We have the reserve system reserve, excuse me, which is a bunch of recovery and repair stuff. And then you've got your actual C drive, which has the operating system. You could have 2 more partitions on this disk if you wanted to. Okay, so that's pretty much it for basic disks. This is how you will get them initialized into either MBR or GPT, and then to partition, to actually create parts of a disk that can be used. That's where we just right-click and create new volumes. Simple volumes, for the most part, is what we'll be sticking with. Okay, so now there are a couple other ways that we can store or kind of split up these different types of disks. One of the things that we can do is something called a virtual hard disk. Now, a virtual hard disk is essentially what it sounds like. Like this virtual machine that we have, this virtual machine, the hard disk on this virtual machine is basically a file sitting on your computer, right? But this software allows it to basically be a whole hard drive that gets used on a machine. Well, we can do that same thing in Windows with a virtual hard disk. Now, a virtual hard disk is essentially a file that Windows looks at and treats as a hard drive. Now, one of the cool things about virtual hard drives is that you can copy them into other computers and set them up as a virtual hard drive on other computers. So imagine it's this little virtual box that contains stuff, and you can take that stuff and just copy that one little box and to another computer, and that computer will eventually, if you set it up, it'll treat it just like another drive with all that same stuff in it. You can also, use them to create larger pools of data as well. So let me give you an example of what I mean. So if I'm going to make a virtual hard drive, I need to first of all create the file that I want it to be. So let me go to the File Explorer, the local disk, and I'm going to create a folder to store my virtual hard drives because I'm going to make a couple of them. So we'll call it VHDs, so virtual hard drives. Okay, so now that I've created that, if I go back to computer management, in disk management over here on the right side, there's more actions. These actions, if I click on it, are right here. We can rescan if we think we're not seeing a drive. We can rescan to try and locate new drives. Refresh just refreshes the screen. Right here though, create and attach VHD. VHD standing for virtual hard drive. So I'm going to create one. Click on it to create it. I have to specify the location for the hard drive, for the virtual disk. So if I browse, let me get to local drive, my virtual hard disk folder, and in here I'm going to create a new file, and I'll just call it VHD1. So that is my first virtual hard drive that I'm going to create. That is a file that is going to store all the information. So save. The location is set. How big do I want it to be? Notice this is in megabytes. Megabytes are not gigabytes. Gigabytes are 1,000 megabytes each. This is what the standard hard drive is measured in. 100 gigabytes, 200, 500 gigabytes. And then when they start getting even larger, 1,000 gigabytes is a terabyte. We don't have that much space. So I'm just going to say a 10 gigabyte virtual hard drive. Okay? So down here, the hard disk type, we have two types. There's the fixed size, which Windows recommends. This is basically, it carves up a space. So I would carve up a 10 gigabyte chunk of space on my hard drive and save that for this virtual hard drive. So this thing would be 10 gigabytes, even if there is no data in it. It would be this big empty box of 10 gigabytes. Dynamically expanding basically starts out as big as it is. So if there's nothing in it, it's going to be really small. And then as you add to the hard drive, as you add to the virtual hard drive, it gets bigger and bigger. So let's just set it to dynamically expanding, just to have some fun. So I hit OK. And then notice we've got a new disk down here. This is the virtual hard disk. Notice it's 10 gigabytes. It is got the down arrow because it hasn't been initialized yet. This is just like we just plugged in a new hard drive. It's a virtual hard drive. So, okay, let's initialize it. Right click on disk and now initialize disk. And we'll go through the same thing that we just did with the first two. We'll keep it as a master boot record. And now it's online and ready to go, mostly. At this point, if we want this to show up, we need to show up in the computer up here. Like, see how our homework has shown up. We have to partition it, and we need to give it a drive letter, a place, what we call a mount point, a place where the operating system knows to look for that disk. So let's create a new simple volume, and we'll let it take up the whole thing. It's going to assign it drive letter F now because F is available. Okay, and it'll format it, and ta-da, we have a new volume. We have the F drive. Now, the F drive here, this is a file. This is this file right here. If I go into my virtual hard drives, VHD1, that is this disk. Okay, so a file is being mounted as a disk. It's being treated as a disk, a virtual disk. And let's see. If I go to properties, it gives me the information like there's nothing in it right now, right? It has the ability to hold 10 gigabytes of space, or about 10 gigabytes. Things are never going to be 100% because they count in binary and we don't. And so when I say 10 gigabytes, there's going to be a little bit of space used up for just administrative work, basically, and the rest of this is what's available to us. I also can change the, here in properties, I can change the name. So I'm going to call this my virtual hard disk 1. So just to keep it safe. So if I actually create a second disk, I'll know what it is. So this is a virtual hard disk. I now know that. Now, one of the things I can do in disk management is, you see this attach and detach VHDs? Attach VHDs. If I create a new one and I don't want it and it's not attached, I'll like copy a new one into my computer, I can attach it here. But in this case, the way we've created it, it's ready to go. If I want to detach it, like say I want to copy it, I can't have it sitting on the system if I want to copy it, because the system kind of locks out part of the hard drive. If it's using it, it doesn't want anyone else to grab it. So I can't copy the whole thing. If I detach the hard drive, this is the same thing as like pulling a USB drive out of the system. Detach it, making sure that this is what I want to detach. Yes. So then it pulls it off. Now notice it's not there. It's as if it were gone. It's like I pulled the USB stick out. If I want to put it back in, I go to attach. It'll ask me which one do I want to attach. I got to go find it. There's the one I want to attach. Okay. Okay. And now it's back. And now here it is. It's like I plugged it back in. So that's virtual hard drives. Okay, so that's all I'm going to cover in this lecture. Next lecture, we're going to talk about storage spaces, basically taking multiple disks and using them as a single disk or as a single pool of space that we can use.